Tonight we're looking at Esther. See, a lot of times what I think happens is that we make this misunderstanding. We hear the term courage, or we hear, more specifically, I think the term biblical courage. We think courage in the Bible and courage in real life are different, but the Bible is just the recording of real life that's already taken place. And so when we think about biblical courage, a lot of times I think what happens to us is we get this conflated image that biblical courage only means the David who goes out and slays Goliath, or the Elijah who goes out onto Mount Carmel and slays the 400 prophets of Baal, or the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego who go into the fiery furnace saying the whole way, even if our God doesn't save us, we still can't worship anybody else. Maybe we think of Paul, who we'll talk about next week, or we think about Noah, who braved this storm that's coming against all of humanity at this one point. But here's the kicker. All of these times that we think of biblical courage, we're thinking of men. And men are not the only people where we see biblical courage exemplified. If we think that biblical courage only takes place in the lives of men in the Bible, we miss these droves of women whose actions, whose courageous, faithful actions saved entire nations, one of which we look at tonight. Now, ladies, I know that I don't have to say this, but I feel like it's worth it to say you are courageous, godly women if you desire to be so. So if that is your desire, man, then live confidently in that. You don't have to fit into some sort of mold. You don't have to fit into some sort of design for what a woman looks like. You can live as these biblical women lived, as we'll look at this evening. And Esther is not our lone example. Like when we look throughout Scripture, there are multiple examples. There are 3 women in Matthew's lineage of Jesus, all of whom possessed great courage. But Esther is the one that we focus on tonight. And so we look at the beginning of the book of Esther in Esther chapter 2. And I'm not going to read it because Esther is this narrative book of the Bible. And so it's a lot of story, which means there's a lot of text to read. And so just for the sake of time, I'm not going to read everything out. But just to summarize, what we see in Esther chapter 2 is this: the story of a woman who comes from very lowly places. Esther is an orphan in a time when being an orphan meant not having really any advantages or any protection in your life. And Esther comes from being this orphaned small girl all the way up to what we see in Esther chapter 2 of this woman who is now rising to the queenship of this nation called Persia. Esther goes from this lowly position and she comes into the house of her uncle Mordecai. Mordecai takes her in, and through a sequence of events, what's ultimately called God's favor, or what I'll look at as God's providence here in a second, ultimately, this all brings Esther to this point where she finds herself living in the palace of the king. And it's not through any actions that Esther did herself. It's not any real particular thing that she was able to do. It's because the favor of God, what we understand to be God's providence, is going before her the whole way. Now, God's providence is this really big way of just saying that God has a plan. That for God to work providentially means He has a plan that He has set out before time, that He is going to organize and orchestrate events in order to make that plan come to fulfillment. And He's doing this very explicitly in the life of Esther. He does it over and over and over again. If you read the book of Esther, constantly you're seeing Esther gained favor with somebody. Esther received favor, or even Mordecai in many cases received favor. And every time we see that, it's an example of God's providence going before Esther or Mordecai in order to see His plans come to fulfillment. God's favor finds Esther as an orphan. It finds her in Mordecai's home. It finds her in the presence of the king's servant. It eventually all the way takes her to becoming the queen of Persia. But what we have to understand is that God's plan, God's providence, is always orchestrating itself up to the end of God's purpose. And what is that purpose? When we look in Esther chapter 4, verses 10 through 17. Before we do that, though, we have to understand is the setting for what I'm about to read. So the setting is this man Haman, who's a servant of the king, comes into the king after having this altercation with Mordecai, Esther's uncle, where Mordecai refused to bow down to Haman. And Haman gets ticked. He's not happy about this This is not okay for him. And so Haman makes this plot up where he's going to go and have the king decree that all of the Jews be rounded up and exterminated. Mordecai falls into this category. Esther falls into this category, but nobody knows that yet. And Mordecai hears of this plan, and so he decides in chapter 4 to go to his niece, Esther, and give her some instructions. And we read these instructions of verses 10 through 17. Starting in verse 10, it says this: Then Esther spoke to Hathach and commanded him to go to Mordecai and say, All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law, to be put to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter so that he may live. But as for me, I have not been called to come into the king these 30 days. And they told Mordecai what Esther had said. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, Do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, Go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, and hold a fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. Mordecai then went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. This is a bold call here. Mordecai hears about this plan that Haman's hatched to have all of the people of God eliminated from the land. And he goes to Esther, who he knows is in the king's palace. Esther doesn't have any power of her own, but she has some proximity to power because she lives in the king's palace. He goes to her and he says, Look, you need to intervene on behalf of your people. You need to step in here because you're the only person, you're the closest person to the king that could make a difference in the situation that we all find ourselves in right now. Now, what we have to understand is how big of a call this would have been for Mordecai to make of Esther. When Mordecai goes to Esther, what we understand is that Esther is in a place of comfort. She is living in the palace. She is the queen of Persia. And more than that, nobody knows that she's a Jew. Nobody's aware of it at this point because Mordecai had told her previously not to let anybody know that she was a Jew. Now, what we can understand from that is that to be a Jew, to be a part of the people of God at this time, was not an easy thing. It was an already dangerous task without dudes like Haman running around saying, I want to get rid of all these people because one guy refused to bow down to me. This is a dangerous thing. When Haman goes to Esther, he is saying, will you align yourself with the people and the purpose of God, or will you continue to live in comfortable silence in the palace of the king? More than that, what we understand from previous reading in the book of Esther is that the Persian culture was this incredibly shallow, vapid culture. They were obsessed with image and with beauty because what we read in Esther 2:17 is that the only reason Esther gains favor with the king, other than God going before her, is her looks. The king looks on Esther and he says, man, she's fine. I want to hook up with her. It is essentially what he's going out and saying. I know that's a kind of a crass way to put it, but that's what's going on. She gains favor with the king because the king is interested in her body. That's what's happening here. And so what we see then in verse 11 of chapter 4 is that Esther in 30 days hasn't been called to the king. But understand this, the king hasn't been sleeping alone during this time. The king's not just waiting until the next time that he calls Esther into himself. He has an entire harem of women that he's calling in on these nights when he's not going to Esther. This would typically mean that Esther has fallen out of her beauty favor with the king. Now, let's understand what it means when someone goes to the king who hasn't been called to him yet. If you go to the king when you haven't been called, this isn't some scenario where he just says, hey, guards, lock her up and go just take her to the dungeon for a little bit. In this time, for a king of Persia to have someone come to him that wasn't called directly by him was an offense of the highest order to them. And so what he would do is he would have his throne that he's sitting on, but around this throne, there would be this 4-person guard of these men who were armed with axes. And if someone came to the king who the king had not called, and the king said, you know what, I don't want that person here, I'm not going to extend my scepter to them, that guard would go grab that person and execute them in front of the king at that very moment. This is not a light deal here. This is not something that would have been really easy for Esther to take part in, because she knows her life is done in that moment if the king does not extend his scepter to her. She must go on behalf of the people of God and basically out herself as a Jew in order to stand up for the rest of God's people. See, if Esther goes through with this, she is risking literally everything in her life with a very small chance in her mind of it going well for her unless God has already gone before her. Just like we see in the life of David, if God has not gone before Esther in this moment, she has very little chance of success in this endeavor. This is a major turning point in Esther's story. And what does she do? What does she ask of Mordecai after he's made this request of her? She says, all right, you take your people, I'm going to take my people, and we're going to go pray and we're going to go fast in preparation for this for 3 whole days. We have to prepare our hearts. Esther understands that her courage in the providence of God doesn't negate her need for heart preparation. Us having courage in the providence of God or in God's plan doesn't mean that we negate our need for prayer daily to Him. It doesn't mean that we shirk off the responsibility that He calls us to of fasting in order to hear a direct word from Him. See, trust in the Lord, absolutely, 100%. Put your trust in the Lord because He is good and mighty and worthy of it. But be diligent about humbling yourself before the Lord on a daily, consistent basis, because that is where true courage is born. If we're not taking any time to humble ourselves before the Lord, how can we be confident of the knowledge we have of Him when it comes time to use that knowledge in action? And Esther utters these famous last words, if I perish, I perish. Like, what a mic drop baller statement to make. If I die, I die, whatever. Like I said before, it rings with the same words that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego go into the flaming furnace with. Look, if our God doesn't save us, so be it. We're not going to worship anybody else. That is what singular, focused courage looks like. And that courage doesn't come from just passively pursuing the Lord. It comes from actively seeking after Him in humility day in and day out. And so they fast for 3 days, they pray for 3 days, and Esther finally goes in. And as she goes, she's not just going for herself. Esther is going as a representative for all of God's people. Again, this story sounds kind of familiar in the whole of Scripture. Esther goes before the king with the life and the vitality of God's people in her very hands. And thankfully, because of the providence of God going before her, the king extends his scepter and is willing to hear her plea. And this begins this whole plot of God redeeming what Haman had meant for evil into the good of God's people. Now the book ends, Haman had built this like crazy, ridiculously tall place where he was going to hang Mordecai on. And eventually Haman is hanged in the place where Mordecai was supposed to be hanged. It's a massive reversal. And as Haman hangs from these gallows, we see a similar representation that happens further on in the history of God's biblical narrative. This is a huge reversal because the Bible is about huge reversals of fortune. Like we look into the Gospels, and when we see Esther going in the place of all of God's people, we also see Jesus going to the cross in the place of God's people. And as there was a plan for evil that was meant to end the life of God's people, Jesus steps into that situation with a reversal of fortunes and brings redemption and saving grace to God's people. See, God's people are delivered once by Esther, but they are delivered for all time in Jesus. Just as Esther declared, if I perish, I perish, Jesus declares, Father, not my will, but yours be done. In both instances, we see a confidence in God's call that comes from the assurance of God's providence. And so my question for us is, do we trust in God's providence today? Do we believe that he has a plan? And yeah, I get it. It's easy to sit in a seat right now where we're in a air-conditioned room where we are living basically comfortable lives in comparison with most of the people around the world. It's easy to say that we have a confidence in God's plan. What happens when that comfort falls away? What do we lean on when the air conditioning goes out? What's the thing that we put our hope and our trust and our confidence in when the comforts that we've enjoyed are removed from us and all that's left is what we have actually placed our hope in prior to that moment? See, when we're presented with the opportunity to act on behalf of God and his people, when we've been brought forward, as Mordecai says, this amazing line, if you've been brought forward for such a time as this, do we lean into the providence of God because we have sat in the presence of God? Because that's what all of this comes back to. Where have we sat ourselves? If we've sat ourselves in the presence of God, then what will naturally flow out in those moments is the purpose and the action of God. But if we have sat in the presence of something else, then what will naturally flow out is whatever we've filled that space with. See, friends, he is calling us. He's calling all of us. No matter where you think you are or whether you may be at this moment, he's calling all of us daily to place our comfort and our confidence in him and in nothing else. But whether we respond to that now or later, I need us to understand this. This is the last thing I've got for you. Whether we have placed our comfort and our confidence, our courage, our hope, whatever you want to call it, in him right now, or whether we have not, whether you are living currently, wilding out in your circumstances, know this: his providence is still going before you at this very moment. God's providence is going before Esther long before Esther comes to a saving knowledge of who God is. And in just the same way, if you're sitting in this room right now and you're thinking to yourself, none of this makes sense, I have no desire to pursue the providence, the plan, the purpose of God, whatever, his plan and his purpose and his providence has not stopped going forward for you. And at some point, whether it be in the near future or on your deathbed, that providence will come to bear in the purpose of God, and it will be for your good, and it will be for his glory.